Okay.
Okay. Today I'm going to be talking about sexual explicitness and libertinism in London during the Restoration period. With specific focus on Hobbesian influence on society, and in particular his influence upon Rochester, and how through Hobbes, Rochester depicts different types of libertinism and appears to mature libertinism throughout his poetry. This is emphasised by an eBay text of a eulogy written about Rochester, declaring his repentance for his libertine ways. I will also focus upon two of Rochester's poems, A Ramble in St James's Park, which was the subject of Hazel's video, and A Satire on Charles II, and suggest that Rochester attempts to link romance and libertinism with these texts, showing his maturity to libertine values. Further to this, I will discuss and analyse the libertinism on Charles II and the impact it had in his court. So, firstly, I'd like to discuss with you all what libertinism is and how it originated. These definitions and origins impact greatly with how we view libertinism and how we read libertine literature. As you can see, alluded to most within these definitions is the idea of freedom. Freedom from morals, freedom from society, and originally freedom from slavery. This was adapted to suggest that libertinism was freedom from societal rules. This freed man has been manipulated to enable an immoral sexual freedom without repercussions. This correlates with one basis of libertinism, which is Hobbesian theory. When discussing libertinism, it is important to analyse Hobbesian theory. Thomas Hobbes was a prevalent philosopher at the time of libertinism. Hobbes stressed the need to follow one's desires and emphasised individualism. This was utilised as a basis to the libertine theology. At its extreme, this led to immorality being viewed as moral. Warren Cheney states that what Hobbes preached was manipulated into libertine values. They retained the need to follow desires to ignore the confines of morality and religion. Libertines, like Rochester, a professed disciple, reinterpreted Hobbes, choosing to emphasise certain aspects of his philosophical system and ignore others as it suited them. Hobbes presented an amoral and non-aesthetic treatment of passions and desires. Yet Hobbes fervently argued that although men should act upon their desires, men are independent moral agents, with the ability to regulate actions whilst keeping principles at the forefront of their minds. With this in mind, we are to assume that this is the part of the theory that the libertines ignored. This is emphasised by Cheney again, arguing that Hobbesian doctrines serve the libertine poets and dramatists as a way of interpreting human conduct. This suggests that libertine literature, in fact, displays the realities of life and human conduct, with Hobbesian doctrines aiding the depictions. People submit to their desires even though they are able to resist, which would be the moral thing to do. Although becoming the manipulated basis of libertinism, Hobbes was not adverse to libertines. He in fact was a great royalist. His theory depended upon autocratic rule, and he had firm roots with Charles II. During the Civil War, Thomas Hobbes went to France due to fears of persecution, and whilst there he became the mathematics tutor of Charles II. This suggests that he was not opposed to libertinism and was well known to immorality, following one's desires, which is, in the case of libertinism, sexual desires. Rochester had a rollercoaster type relationship with libertinism throughout his life and poetry. He begins with a love for all things libertine, engulfed in the amoral aptitude for fulfilling desires. He revelled in the freeness of rules and upheld the rakish characteristics of sexual freedom. Yet when we get to the poems A Ramble in St James's Park and A Satire on Charles II, we see a literative U-turn. Rochester appears to have matured to the sexual liberation of libertinism. With this maturity, he attempts to divulge romantic verses within his poetry, entwining romance with sexual freedom. As Melissa Sanchez states, the conceptual modes of romance and libertinism are Rochester's poetry is typically read as endorsing one or the other response. This supports the idea that romance and sexual desire are linked within Rochester's work. He cannot write about one without endorsing the other. Rochester seems to relate aspects of his own maturity into his poems. As Sanchez argues, Rochester links romance and libertinism, and therefore seems to suggest that underlying libertinism's theory, morality and love, are in fact waiting to be uncovered. Beyond mere shock, effect, or satiric moralisation, the explicits that permeate Rochester's writing depict libertine materialism's doomed endeavour to divest things of their romantic pretensions. Divesting romantic pretensions into his writing stresses Rochester's maturity. He no longer debauches in sexuality. Rochester juxtaposes romantic descriptions with typically unromantic and rather sordid descriptions. This stresses the libertine influence upon Rochester's poetry. Thunderbolts become pricks, nymphs, whores, souls, sperm, but these rhetorical transformations do not so much unmask the sordid reality as insist in its coexistence with the more spiritualized objects. This quote by Sanchez suggests that Rochester does not utilise these depictions in a bid to rid his poetry of romance, but rather to stress the link between romance and the explicit descriptions and associations with libertinism. Some passages of The Life and Death of John Williams Rochester, written by Gilbert Burnet, depicts Rochester repenting for his immoral libertine ways. Burnet stresses the maturity that Rochester has gained since his illness, and declares that he wished to show the flaws of libertinism, even at the cost of his own name. Being so sincere in his repentance that he was not unwilling to take shame to himself by suffering his faults to be exposed for the benefits of others. Burnet stresses that although he did not know Rochester before he became ill and whilst he was at the height of his libertinism, he does declare that Rochester felt that his actions before his literative maturity were follies and madness. Yet when he reflected on all his former courses, even before his mind was illuminated with better thoughts, he counted them as madness and folly. So the juxtaposition of romance and sexual explicitness within Rochester's poems are emphasised. A Ramble in St James's Park and Satire on Charles II depict these. As A.D. Cousin states, Rochester may criticise or advocate reasoned submission to passion and praise, or attack the panoply of love. Rochester's take on love stressed the differences between passion and love. So in A Ramble in St James's Park, the romantic and the libertine is explored throughout the poem. In the first verse, Rochester breaks up the lines by describing the beauty of the park with the vulgar descriptions of sex and libertine values. These libertine values are depicted as depraved. This separation attempts to mimic the ideas of beauty in the park, hiding the sinful acts being committed. Once rows of mandrakes tall did rise, whose lured tops swept the very skies, each imitative branch does twine in some love fold of orotine. Rochester focuses on the beauty of flowers and juxtaposes these with the expletives associated with libertinism. The idea that the promiscuity in libertinism occurs specifically in St James's Park seems to reflect the idea of the countryside and the city. The countryside, or park in the town, is a man-made beauty, yet this beauty is being corrupted by the city, romance being corrupted by libertinism. The countryside and city portray more than just romance and libertinism. They illustrate the private and the public sphere. This poem suggests that sexuality has permeated the private sphere into the public sphere, and therefore has eroticised the public sphere. Rochester stresses the influence libertinism had within Restoration London. Public figures take their private lives into the public sphere. Carmen, divines, great lords and tailors, apprentices, poets, pimps and jailers, footmen, fine fops, who here arrive and here promiscuously they swive. Listing the people who are renowned for their licentious manners, it suggests how corrupt the libertine way was within society. Rochester focuses on romance versus the lust of libertinism in the latter half of The Ramble in St James's Park. He depicts a libertine who believes they are above love. Why this treachery to humble, fond, believing men who gave the privilege above the nice allowances of love? This suggests that he believes that many libertines feel they are too privileged with immorality to feel love and romance. Yet Rochester still provides positives that could be gained by being a libertine. They have sexual freedom and feel there is something extra in lust. Such natural freedoms are but just, there's something generous in mere lust. This appears to stress the libertine values, the importance of freedom and lust, suggesting that perhaps Rochester was not completely disillusioned with libertinism at his time. So, A Satire on Charles II. This poem depicts a satiric characterisation of the libertine King Charles II. Rochester appears to criticise the debauchery which surrounded King Charles II and his court. The poem is a characteristic of Rochester, both in its shockingly indecorous language and in the scorn it directs at the institution of monarchy. This suggests that although seeming as an attack on the king, it primarily scorns the idea of monarchy, their liberation, and those who are in control of the country. The line, "Poor prince, like by buffoons at highlights the disenchantment and cynical views about the court at the time. Perhaps Rochester is demeaning the monarchy in a bid to attack libertinism. This is supported by William Hazlitt, who argues his contempt for everything that others respect almost amounts to sublimity. Rochester's cynicism, however, is typical of libertinism deriving from Hobbesian theory. This cynicism is continued into the depictions of romance and love in relation to Charles II. At the start of the poem, Rochester depicts the ultimate liberty, revelling in his sexual freedom, yet throughout the poem, Rochester proposes that love is in fact the best relief. However, he criticises that to love and be loved is too late. The best relief of his declining years, oft he bewails his fortune and her fate, to love so well and be beloved so late. This poem stresses Rochester's maturity to libertinism and romance, highlighting a disillusionment with all things liberty. Restoration literature reflects the leniency of Charles II and his libertinism in court. His enjoyment in the arts and encouragement of sexual explicitness propelled authors and poets like Rochester into society. Often these texts would mimic, relay and mock the events involving the king personally and the rakish aristocrats of his court. As soon as he returned from France, King Charles II established the tone of his court, in town and country, based on personal pleasure and liberty. Cousins suggest that the relationship of a satire to Rochester's critique of private and social disorder can be suggested by a glance at the other verse's satires, in which he explores how society is pervaded by a discord of the kind Charles embodied. This stresses the discontent of the private sphere becoming the public sphere, and suggests that the libertinism that Charles II embodied permeated society, and Rochester had become disillusioned with libertinism. Rochester explains the sexual anarchy he perceives at the heart of England's government. Libertinism is the root of the moral government. So, by looking at Rochester's poetry in Charles II in relation to Hobbesian theory, it's apparent how the influence of libertinism changed in London during the Restoration period and how this adapted literature at the time. Questions?
I've got one. I wanted to kind of just ask you a little bit more about the idea that the public sphere being infected by the private sphere. Is that a development of a particular aspect of Hobbesian thought? What was the connection between those? I think that's
well, Hobbesian was more about being cynical. He wanted to have like freedom, but he also realised that you couldn't have freedom without knowing your own mind. And his wasn't necessarily about the public sphere being the private sphere. That was more about the manipulation they made of his theory. So it was all about how Charles II was obviously a libertine, but he allowed that in society. And the fact that everything happened in St. James's Park, it was like the things that should be private was then put into the public sphere. So that was...
I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the Burnett text, which you kind of touched on that one relatively briefly.
Yes.
What was that adding to your argument about the development of Rochester's kind of thinking about libertinism through his career?
Well, throughout, we've got the book, the collection of his poetry, and throughout it shows how he matures, like towards his theory of libertinism. And in A Satire Against Reason and Mankind, he completely changes his view on that. And so I thought if I brought in, like a eulogy, Burnett was asked to write this for Rochester, and he knew him when he was repenting for what he'd done, and he felt bad about how he'd acted, and how he wanted to show that it probably wasn't the right way to go, and he kind of went on to religion. And I thought that kind of coincided with how his poetry had matured and changed throughout his literature.
Okay. Thank you very much.